The Terra Alta and the Ebro's riverbank have always been an eminently agricultural territory. Its dry cultivation system forms a landscape of vineyards, cereal, almond and olive trees with a few notes of fruit trees. This type of cultivation hasn't changed much since the beginning of the past century, but the agriculture activity of the people who still work in the fields has certainly changed. In the first decades of the 20th century, the vineyards had suffered a terrible setback. With the appearance of the phylloxera plague, the peasants abandoned part of their crops to dedicate them to the cultivation of almonds, hazelnut, and olives, a combination of crops that still remains today. Afterwards, the crisis of the rural world was worsened by a few years of droughts and by unstoppable industrialization, taking working hands from the fields and sending them to the factories on the outskirts of Barcelona. During the Second Republic in 1934, the Catalan government enacted the Cropping Contract Law. This law allowed peasants a gradual access to ownership of the land and aimed to solve the conflicts in the countryside. Its approval was the starting point of an important confrontation about jurisdictions between the center-right state government and the center-left Catalan government. This confrontation led to an uprising of the Catalan government on the 6th of October 1934, which was quickly silenced and followed by a strong repression, especially in the countryside. After the elections of the 16th of February 1936, the victory of the Left Party started the agrarian reform again, which would finally be interrupted by the Civil War and the military coup d'etat on the 18th of July. The Civil War was devastating in the countryside. At first, many men abandoned their crops to join the fight, and the few remnants suffered forced actions of collectivization, leading to violent acts like the facts of the Fatarella, where many peasants died. But the Battle of the Ebro destroyed the territory, poisoned its roots, and endangered a whole social and financial system based on cultivating the land. Once the war was over, the landscape was desolate. The fierceness of the battle had destroyed fields, forests, and mountain. The region of Terra Alta and the Ebro's riverbank had a harsh couple of decades ahead. The inhabitants of those towns slowly came back, but the war and the Francoist repression had taken most of the men, and families were left with fewer hands to cultivate the land. Besides, it was dangerous to go out on the fields, as they were filled with projectiles, unexploded ammunition, and dead soldiers' bodies. More than 40% of the cultivated surface in the surroundings of Gandesa was destroyed by artillery, the digging of trenches, shelters, the crossing of troops, tanks and trucks, and the bombing airstrikes during the war. Also, fires caused during the battles burnt the forest down, and the shrapnel encrusted in the trunks made the wood useless. Recovery in the countryside was slow and tiresome. The soil was in awful conditions, and the tools and burden-bearing animals had been sacked during and after the war. In 1940, Gandesa's agricultural cooperative had lost half its members. The few remaining peasants started cultivating on their own the small pieces of land which were still usable. The individual work of these peasants was the main factor of the gradual recovery of the region, along with the recollection of scrap metal to sell in the metallurgic industry, which helped clean the fields. Nowadays, the situation in the rural world is uncertain. There's a progressive decrease of peasants and people willing to work the fields. However, there's also a new trend to favor products with a certificate of origin, guaranteeing a future for those fields. The landscape of Terra Alta and the Ebro's riverbank still has that labyrinthian mosaic of dry cultivations splattered with bushes and small groves of pine trees, but now they coexist with new signs of progress, such as power stations, high-voltage lines, and wind turbines. Yet 70 years later, the wounds caused by the Battle of the Ebro still linger in the human remains and in the scattered trenches standing.